that is isolated from the rest of the world. Number 14. Emma Orbach. The Oxford graduate Emma Orbach has said goodbye to society and decided to devote her life to live in a simpler environment. Nestled in the mountains of West Wales, Emma lives in the home she built herself, a little mud hut that has no electricity or any contact with technology. Orbach owns 3 goats, 2 horses, and 7 chickens. She grows her own fruit and vegetables and collects water from a stream nearby. Her 2 adult children visit their mother frequently, but technologies like phones and laptops are banned from her safe haven. Number 13. Christopher Knight. Widely known as the North Pond Hermit, Christopher Knight lived in complete isolation for 27 years. He resided in the woods of Maine and did not have any contact for more than 3 decades. Apart from living in solitude, Knight was a thief who stole food from nearby cabins and burgled private properties more than 1,000 times in his lifetime. The North Pond Hermit was arrested in 2013 for breaking into a summer camp for the disabled. Number 12. Józef Stołanoga. The Polish-born Józef Stołanoga was known locally as Fred, the hermit who lived nearly 40 years in a tent in West Midlands, England. For unknown reasons, Fred turned his back on society, leaving his wife, his job, and his home behind him. For years, he would live on the streets until finally he settled down in a little tent. Before his death in 2007, Stołanoga had been accepted by the local Hindu community, where he peacefully spent the last decade of his life. Number 11. Willard MacDonald. As a way to avoid fighting in World War II, Willard MacDonald jumped from a troop train and disappeared in the woods. The pacifist walked into the wilderness of Nova Scotia and never looked back for 60 years. When his cabin was destroyed by a fire in 2002, the local county officials built MacDonald his own hut the following year. The hermit could not adapt to his new lifestyle of living and soon fled back into the woods, where his body was later discovered in 2004. Number 10. James Lucas. One hermit that Charles Dickens wrote about in his essay was James Lucas, also known as the Hermit of Hertfordshire. The highly educated, social, energetic, and well-read James lived a life of privilege. But everything changed when his mother died in 1849. The once erudite and well-educated James became a different person. He soon barricaded himself in his home and became extremely paranoid of his relatives. James would ban anyone from visiting him, not even allowing his extended family to touch the mansion. As there were no visitors, the home naturally turned to dust and decay. As a means of survival, Lucas ate bread, cheese, and gin. He never washed or cut his hair, and lived naked in his kitchen. And even though he hated his family, he enjoyed visits from children and vagabonds. Number 9. Agafia Lykova. As a way to avoid religious persecution, the Lykova family fled Stalin's Russia and opted out to live in the wilderness of southern Siberia. The Russian family was so isolated from any means of contact or society that they were unaware of World War II. Agafia Lykova was born in the secluded family. For most of her life, she lived as a peasant from the 18th century and didn't have any human contact outside of her immediate family for nearly 30 years. In 1978, a group of geologists discovered the family by accident. One scientist described Agafia as being distorted by a lifetime of isolation. Her primitive vocabulary and social cues left the impression of the hermit being mentally disabled. But after witnessing her skill in hunting, cooking, and reading, the geologist's assumptions vanished. Agafia had ventured out of her mountainside home 6 times in the past, mostly due to medical-related issues, but has stated that modern cities scare her. She is currently living in her isolated home, and Agafia couldn't be happier. Before we move on, be sure to subscribe to Top 5s with notifications on. Number 8. Noah John Rondo. Rebelling against the big business and industry slavery of 20th century America, Noah John Rondo decided to say goodbye to everything he knew and continued his life in solitude. He ran away from home as a teenager and in 1929 made Cold River his permanent residence. What makes Noah a special hermit is whilst the hermit of the Adirondack Mountains loved his privacy, he was surprisingly very famous. In the 1940s and 1950s, he frequently appeared on sportsman shows to display how he hunted for large animals. In 1947, Noah was even flown to the National Sportsman's Show by helicopter. But his 15 minutes of fame came and went, and the Cold River hermit returned to his secluded life. Apart from hunting, Noah was a lover of astronomy and even played the violin. During his time in solitude, Noah kept extensive journals, the pages of which were filled with his own inventions. It took nearly 25 years to finally decipher these journals, as they were all written in letter substitution ciphers to project his ideas and inventions. Number 7. Valerio Richetti. The New South Wales State Heritage Register was once a humble cave in which resided Valerio Richetti. The Australian hermit, who was a miner and craftsman, had quite a normal life before he finally settled down in his famous cave. Legend says that when Valerio was out walking, he was caught in a sudden rainstorm. He found a nearby cave that served as a temporary shelter. Little did he know that temporary shelter would turn into his 22-year-old long address. His private residence stretched over a kilometer, and soon he built a kitchen, carved a chapel and cisterns for water supply, and even grew a garden. For 22 years, Valerio never had any reason to leave his humble home, until he broke his foot and had to visit a doctor and hospital. Upon registration, the hermit had to give information about his current address, and that's when his magnificent cage was discovered. Richetti had developed a friendship with the doctor that fixed his leg and would often work in his garden to earn some money. After saving up for a trip down to Italy to visit his brother, the Australian hermit never returned back to his cave, and today the same cave is listed on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. Number 6. Richard Prenneke. A book that won the National Outdoor Book Award in 1999 was One Man's Wilderness, an Alaskan Odyssey, which was inspired by Richard Prenneke, the Alaskan wilderness hermit. The self-educated naturalist and former U.S. Navy carpenter went to school and became a diesel mechanic. Richard's impeccable intelligence and adaptability led him to thrive in one of the most remote areas in the world, the Twin Peaks region of Alaska. Richard built his isolated cabin from hand tools entirely by himself. His fine craftsmanship was the result of his carpentry skills. The Alaskan Wilderness Hermit's cabin was so remarkable in 2007 it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Apart from building and decorating his humble cabin, Prenneke also kept up with his daily journaling. The self-educated naturalist would reflect on his surrounding environment and make notes of the local fauna and flora. The food he ate was planted by himself, and he used metal containers for food storage and preservation. And even though Prenneke had been self-sustained for most of his solitary life, he had a friend who would fly over once a year and deliver him supplies. As far as the book One Man's Wilderness, an Alaskan Odyssey goes, the book was written by Sam Keith and was put together using Richard's journals and photography. Number 5. Manfred Naniger. After Manfred Naniger moved to the small village of Camel in Galicia, Spain, he became known as just Man. The German-born hermit was very mysterious in nature. When he first arrived at the village, he was described as a well-dressed and educated man. But after falling madly in love and being rejected by a local teacher, his demeanor completely changed. Manfred said goodbye to the modern society and continued to spend the rest of his last decades in a small oceanside hut he had built himself. With no electricity and water, Naniger began growing fruits and vegetables in his garden. The man that was once praised by the community became a mystical entity in a matter of years. Wearing nothing but a loincloth, the tall, long-haired man who would build large sand sculptures on the beach became the talk of the village. Man was content with the life he had created for himself, until the 2002 oil spill of the Prestige resulted in his ultimate demise. The spill destroyed a large area of the beach, subsequently damaging the ecosystems throughout the surrounding area. This event was too much for the hermit to bear. Man, in a state of disbelief and grief, locked himself in his cabin that he never came out of. As the concerned local community went up to the cabin to check on the mystical hermit, they found him dead. Within days of his sudden passing, man became an international phenomenon and became the first ever man to be killed by an oil spill. Number 4. Robert Harrell. After a string of unsuccessful jobs and a failed marriage, the Fort Fisher hermit left his community behind and never looked back. Robert Harrell, a 62-year-old man whose hopes and dreams were crushed by society, opted out to move to an abandoned World War II bunker in North Carolina. He continued to survive on oyster beds he would fish out of a nearby sea and vegetables he had planted himself. One might assume that the hopeless hermit was isolated from his surroundings, but on the contrary, he soon became the second most popular tourist attraction in North Carolina. His bunker even had a guest book tourists could sign when they paid a visit to the Fort Fisher hermit. But with fame come the rumors. Many believe the hermit was actually keeping thousands of dollars hidden somewhere in his bunker. Some visitors would ask the man for lifelong advice and wisdom, while others simply harassed the hermit and even tried to rob him. A group of men even beat him up and stole his money. But apart from disrespectful visitors, the local residents weren't fans of Robert Harrell either. He was arrested by authorities on charges of vagrancy, but miraculously, Robert successfully defended himself in court and was set free by the local police. Harrell died in 1972, but just like every other aspect of his life, his death was nothing short of abusive. While the cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, many believe he was attacked by a brutal local gang and became the victim of this violent act. Number 3. David Glasheen. The once successful businessman and millionaire David Glasheen left his luxurious life behind. And one of the most successful figures in the mining business, David had everything. But after the stock market crashed in 1987, his life took a dark turn. His wife left him, and his hard-earned $37 million were gone as well. In the hopes of starting a new life, David went to Restoration Island and has been living there for the past 22 years. Now, at the age of 77, Glasheen lives alone with his dog and could not be happier. We all need restoration at some point in our lives, and that's what's happened to me. I'm mentally supercharged, says David. According to the born-again hermit, he lives in heaven and doesn't miss anything except his family, who hasn't visited him even once. My direct family, other than when my daughter died, I've not seen them. It's no point having these issues unresolved, and I miss my family. Number 2. Brendan Grimshaw. One man did something only a few can even dream of. Brendan Grimshaw, at the age of 49, bought a desert island in the Indian Ocean. Brendan was a newspaper editor in 1962 when he purchased the island for only £8,000, or around $10,000. He had heard about hidden pirate treasure buried in the depths of the island, and after 2 major digs, Brendan found some evidence of man-made hiding places. Sadly, no gold or valuable treasure has been found. Grimshaw spent the last decades of his life isolated from society on his private island. The hermit, alongside his friend, planted 16,000 trees, bought and bred giant tortoises in hopes of filling the island with magnificent creatures. Brendan died in 2012, and a year later, the island received its own national park status, visited frequently by tourists from all over the world. Honorable mentions. For our honorable mentions, let's take a look at some of the most famous hermits in history, whose isolations are remembered to this day. William Amos Wilson. William Wilson, better known as the Pennsylvania Hermit, became a figure in the 18th century Pennsylvanian folklore. His life story and how he became a hermit is a tragic tale. After his sister Elizabeth was raped by a man and gave birth to twins, she was lured to the woods where the same men murdered their babies. Even though Elizabeth was convicted of the crime, her brother William's pleas to the governor to release the innocent sister were granted. But as soon as Wilson rushed home, he found his sister dead. Left in complete shock and dismay, William gave up on living in a society filled with injustice. and headed back to his birthplace. The Pennsylvania hermit continued his life living in a cave and supported himself by making millstones. Soon after his death, numerous articles were written in the local newspapers, and he became a figure in 18th century folklore. Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Going back to the 12th century, we revisit the life of Saint Hildegard of Bingen. As a young girl, Hildegard was offered up by her parents to the church. She was to serve her life behind the walls of a monastery, praying and serving God every moment of her life. She was special amongst her peers because Hildegard would often experience visions. After her roommate nun died, the hermit requested to be moved to a secluded monastery, away from the church, where she could gain some independence and continue to serve God in her terms. After being rejected by the head monk, she became paralyzed in her bed. Hildegard eventually got her wish and continued to live her life peacefully in a monastery on top of a mountain, where she published many poems and musical compositions. Number 1. Tom Leopard. The title of the most isolated hermit who hates society has to go to Tom Leopard, an English-born soldier who made the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's most tattooed man. Can you guess what animal print covered his entire body? Yeah, you guessed it right. Starting from his ankles and going up to the top of his head, Tom was covered in leopard print. You may also assume Tom was infatuated by leopards as his entire body was covered in spot. But in reality, he had no affiliation with the animal. He just wanted spots because it would be easier for the tattoo artist to work with on a big scale. Born in Suffolk, England, Leopard was tormented by his society and recalls his brutal time serving in the armed forces. Eventually, Leopard turned his back on society and moved to a small cabin on the Isle. He would come out of his house once a week to receive his pension and stock up on food and then continue living in isolation. He died in 2016 at the age of 80, before he was named the most tattooed male senior citizen. Subscribe to Top 5s for more and check out some of our other popular videos.